can't lose sight of the fact that what the discussion is over is violence, harassment, and intimidation. And the question is, at what point do these forms of action constitute anti-Semitic violence, harassment, and discrimination? I am a total libertarian when it comes to speech, but me having a bullhorn in front of your window is not exactly what we're talking about. There are those lines. Those lines are already there. When the speech becomes action, the question is the action a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act? And at that point, these questions of what constitutes anti-Semitism, that is the point that matters. Universities should be a place where you should be open to all viewpoints. You shouldn't stigmatize. You shouldn't have biased response teams for people's opinions. I think if these elite Ivies want to take the position that they're essentially religiously progressive, then that ought to be their position, and they ought to put that in their charter.
Welcome to the Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm your host of the Contrarian podcast. I'm the CEO of the North American Values Institute, or NAVI, and I'm here to welcome a very special guest today, and that is Chris Schorr. Chris is the Director of Higher Education at the America First Policy Institute. Chris, I think we met each other at a strategy session that was put together by Parents Defending Ed, talking about the opportunities and constraints in the new world of education after Donald Trump's election. And we've since talked a little bit. Then you shared with me an article on woke anti-Semites won't stop with Jewish students that I thought was very thoughtful and very encouraging, by the way. And we can talk about why I was so encouraged by it. And really delighted to have you on. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. You were nice enough to send me a copy of your book as well, Woke Antisemitism, and I thought it was very good, very interesting. And I think the sort of convergence of interest between the sort of liberal, the classical liberal civil rights tradition and kind of like the more conservative tradition coming together on this issue. I think it's a great phenomenon, and it's, I think, a good touch point for a conversation as well.
We're going to flesh that out here today. I think that's an interesting one where it's showing some tensions these days. I just want to first learn more about you. I think when we met, you were in a different role. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your trajectory.
I did my PhD at Georgetown, graduated in 2020, peak woke madness, and my dissertation was defending conservatism and really the American political system from what at the time seemed like a real credible threat from like the alt-right and what we would call white nationalism, right? In the correctly understood, not in the sense that some rhetoric on the left was sort of apply that term to basically anyone, maybe even slightly to the right of center, like Spencer and some of this stuff. Yep. One of the takeaways from that was that one of the things that could be driving heightened white identity in the mass electorate is some of the rhetoric that you explore in your book, this oppressor-oppressed sort of relation, right? And so I had reached out to Carol Swain afterwards because she had written a book on that topic actually 10 years before. Mm-hmm. And so the two of us got together and we started thinking about these issues, and we honed in on this sort of new obscure-ish topic called critical race theory. And at the time it was sort of critical race theory, whiteness studies, post-colonial. It was kind of like this, right? Yes. And then what happened over time is all of that became critical race theory, right? It sort of zoned in.
Yes.
A lot of that was because of James Lindsay's work. And so we wrote this book. It's called Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House, Carol Swain and I. And so our goal was to really take some of the more dense academic research and condense it to like a coffee table book that sort of was very accessible. And so we did that. And of course, this is right as I was entering the job market. And you can imagine there's you become sort of HR kryptonite at that point. And so I worked, right? So
well, in one sense, but it obviously got you a job at the same time, right?
It was always...
You're just very niche.
Right. And it's always this question that I think people of more right-leaning sensibilities have when they go through the higher education process is like you're presented all these opportunities to compromise, and I think the answer is you don't. But and so eventually something will work out, and so anyways, I worked in health policy for a while as a DoD contractor, totally different. And eventually the opportunity arose to work on the issues that I'm really passionate about at the America First Policy Institute. So I started as a senior policy analyst, and I worked primarily on DEI, CRT, gender theory, anti-Semitism. So I would joke I'm the resident culture warrior,
Nice.
And right. And then with the new administration and some staffing changes, I've since taken over as the director of higher education. That's like a couple weeks ago. So
Okay.
Well, very, very excited to be here. Thank you.
Congratulations. We'll talk about higher education as well in its interface with K through 12, which I think is a really important aspect of what we're seeing in K through 12 education. So tell me about the America First Policy Institute. Is it the brains behind the Trump agenda? I mean, how do you think about it?
Yeah, so AFPI, so we're a 501c3, we're a nonprofit, so we're very much independent of the Trump administration. And by the way, I should say, I'm glad you mentioned, because of that nonprofit status, I should always say that, my comments here are my own. Obviously, there are other contexts where I'll be, in another environment, I might be representing AFPI in an official kind of way. But of course, I'm representing my thoughts, not AFPI's. But so we're obviously nonpartisan, but we're focused on policy education, would I guess be the best way to think about it. Mm-hmm. And I would say generally administration aligned in the sense of representing the America First movement. And so we're very young. I don't know that there's an institution that has ever, a think tank that's ever punched above its sort of weight class in the way that AFPI has. And our placements in the administration, I don't have an exact number, but some of the big names include Linda McMahon, Brooke Rollins, Attorney General Pam Bondi, right? So EdSec, Agriculture Sec. And Kash Patel was affiliated with it. There are quite a few. I'm very excited to be a part of this. It's this kind of momentous thing that's happening, and I like to think that higher education is an important part of that.
Absolutely. So I want to start with the article you wrote, which was sort of my first foray into your writing and thinking, and it was fascinating because obviously, look, I wrote a book called Woke Antisemitism, and here a nice Christian fellow from America First Policy Institute writes a piece on how the woke anti-Semites have. I'm sorry, what was the last part of it? What?
Woke anti-Semites won't stop with Jewish students. Yeah,
won't stop with Jewish. And that piece, you make you talk about first they come for the Saturday people, then they come for the Sunday people. Saturday people meaning Jews, Sunday people meaning Christians, and you're warning the right in a way to not to look at this as if somehow this is just about the Jews. This is a larger ideological phenomena that actually will come to hurt Christians. And I have to tell you, after I read your article, I shared it with a bunch of people within the Jewish community. And with the following commentary, which may be different than the way you think about it, but let's explore. And my commentary was, this is fascinating. I'm worried that there are people on the right, including within the MAGA movement, who are sort of becoming increasingly hostile to Jewish interests. I'm not, and this is not a commentary on the entire movement at all. There are these forces, and it seems to me that there are other forces that are well aligned with us who see wokeism as an attack on American values, Western values, Enlightenment values, but also on the Jewish community, know that that's bad for Christianity. And there are allies, and that this is part of an internecine war within the right, and that we have a vested interest in cheering for the Chris Schorrs of the world. And hope to empower them because they're fighting a fight that's very important for the well-being of the Jewish community. I'm just saying that's how I framed it to my fellow Jews. What do you make of that?
So it's really interesting. I would take the recent Antisemitism Awareness Act as a sort of test case of this theory, right? So your book is basically like, okay, we have this anti-Semitic threat bubbling up within the left.
Right.
And the way you're framing it is, it's almost as though there's a sort of parallel thing happening on the right. The Antisemitism Awareness Act passed overwhelmingly in the House. I think it had one Republican opponent. I could be wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, the person in question is just very sort of libertarian on, and so it's not like it wasn't taking issue with resisting anti-Semitism. It's kind of like the Goldwater exception or the Ron Paul exception, as they used to say, right?
Yeah.
So you have total unanimity on the right in elected government on this issue. It then died in the Senate at the time under Democratic control. Why did it die in the Senate? Because you have what you talk about in this book, right? And it's a mass level phenomenon, right? You have among young progressive people overwhelming acceptance of the oppressor-oppressed dynamic. This is not something you see on the right. You've found this, right? Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Harvard-Harris has found this by 2/3 young people, and these would be the progressive young people, think that Jews are a class of oppressors. The ADL is finding this, right? So I would argue that the two sides are not equivalent in this respect.
Okay, let's stipulate that that's correct.
Yeah.
But
I do want to address your question.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that the Twitter, or now X, is a poor barometer for broader conservative thinking. And I don't even, one of the things about being a conservative is that we do a lot of gatekeeping. And so this is part of what, honestly, my dissertation was gatekeeping. It's like alt-right, not conservative, right? That's kind of the point, right? So, the random kind of Nazi on Twitter is just not relevant to the conversation, right?
But Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens are. And to the degree which they might have some backers, makes people like me worry. Again, I'm not comparing the two as mass phenomena, right? People were asleep at the wheel on the left while this ideological phenomena crept into the discourse and then dominated. You could see that it doesn't take such a powerful imagination to imagine the same thing happening on the right too over time if we're not gatekeeping effectively.
Yeah, and I agree. I think I would say the Candace Owens of it all concerns me more so than the Tucker. I think I'm a big supporter of Israel, and the right is broadly very supportive of Israel.
Yes.
I think that's probably more where Tucker Carlson comes in. But I do think there's maybe a strain that says scaling back our foreign commitments includes sort of disengaging from support for Israel. I think that's a huge mistake. But what I see less of outside of some very niche kind of out there segments is anything that's sort of targeting Jews specifically.
Yes.
And I would add, so the big scary term these days is Christian nationalist, right?
Yes.
And so as a Christian and as a nationalist, I feel like I should probably weigh in on this. So I think that most of what people talk about as Christian nationalism would fall under the category of just conservative from 30 years ago, right?
Sure.
If some person says, it's a shame they took the Bibles out of the public schools, today that's a Christian nationalist. Yesterday that was just a conservative. That project is not AFPI, but just sort of commenting. A lot of what that project would do, and this is in line with Hazony, right? Yoram Hazony. Right?
I was just about to go to Hazony.
Exactly.
You beat me to the punch. Yeah.
So you can't like there's. When Jewish conservative leaders are sort of thought leaders are kind of guiding this. And then even among...
By the way, Hazony, interestingly, is probably, even though he's an Orthodox Jew, is probably more of a Christian thought leader than a Jewish thought leader. Even among conservatives. A lot of the discourse among Jewish conservatives and thinkers, although I don't consider myself one, and Hazony is not really a talked about figure, but when you go to Christian, I won't call it Christian nationalism or whatever, American first circles and post-liberal conversation and NatCons, if you will, all of a sudden Hazony reigns supreme.
I would push you and maybe your friends to see this a slightly different way, like a post-liberal kind of approach to the American tradition, and which is really about trying to reclaim the secular spaces and sort of contesting this idea that there's any such thing as true neutrality, right? Because the problem from our perspective, I think, is that, again, this is me, is that procedural secularism flows right into programmatic secularism. and there is no actual break point. The public sphere will always be a place of competing values. And there are different voices in what you might call Christian nationalism, and there's some that I have no time for. But I would say, direct your friends over to Doug Wilson, because he's been a huge combatant against anti-Semitism, sort of in that space, right? And also, if you strip away a lot of the sort of the more combative rhetoric, he's actually very, I would say, more in line with sort of traditional liberal commitments. But what's happening is there's a way of sort of founding those commitments, or sort of emphasizing the Judeo-Christian inheritance, right? And so if you think in terms of liberal values, it's like, where did all this come from?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
But the question is, what is actually going to replace procedural secularism?
Right.
So Chris Rufo sort of entered this conversation in a very forceful way, saying classical liberals, you had your chance, you blew it. You sat on the sidelines while this left-wing ideology took hold and overtook your classical liberalism, and now you're whining about it. Maybe I joined you in those early days whining about it. The backlash is fully afoot. Now we're going to try to replace it with something different than classical liberalism.
Yeah.
I agree with you. There's no such thing as, an ideology-free zone, right? We're talking about, civics, for example, which I'm a big believer in, is not ideologically neutral. It believes it starts with a basic idea of American democratic principles and liberal, but also integrated into that civics framework. And I think it can be done in a way that's not neutral, but it at least is reflective of a broad consensus of American society. Ideas like freedom of thought, ideas like free exchange of ideas, equal opportunity, even pluralism, e pluribus unum. Those foundational values integrated within sort of a classical liberal values framework, with acknowledging, of course, the Judeo-Christian roots, and maybe even emphasizing them much more than we have in the recent past. I mean, I think that's a consensus that probably people like you and me might be able to live. Can you live with it? I guess.
Oh, absolutely. No, that's my preferred outcome. And there's a great piece by Hazony and I believe Ivory is the second person. It's called "What is Conservatism?" And it basically I think it's in. Might be Foreign Affairs. Fantastic though, and it basically goes through and it makes it's sort of like a revisionism, but not in like the negative sense. It's basically saying like, no, we've imagined American values as this extension of classical liberal values, but in fact, classical liberalism was itself this kind of rebranding of this broader, I would say Christian tradition, but embedded in that is Judeo-Christian tradition, right? And Hazony's really strong on that point, obviously. So I totally agree. I think that the way I would, if I were to adopt the post-liberal label, which I'm not sure that I would, but I would call myself a liberal post-liberal, which has to be the most obnoxious way to frame it conceivable.
I love it, though. I love it. I want you to brand it in the discussion. Did you read Jonathan Rauch's book Cross Purposes yet? Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And of course, Jonathan is a Jewish, gay, classical liberal Democrat who's upset that Christianity, that liberalism, secular liberalism, is completely dependent on Christianity, the Judeo-Christian ethic. Okay, but argues that that it was Christianity that abandoned liberalism, not that liberal. He'd say, well, of course, liberalism also abandoned Christianity, and he sort of, but he's more angry in the book at Christianity's abandonment, not liberalism's abandonment of that bargain. And it seems to me that it's a dance, and that maybe the two have to come back and learn how to dance once again with each other somehow and find a new equilibrium. So let's go. I know this was very abstract, and people are going to be looking for something more tangible here about what we do and how we're going to change the world. So let's go from that. Let's climb down the ladder of abstraction for a second.
But at the same time, we did come to a place of I think convergence, and so it's a good place to start, because like your evolution from sort of a Jewish civil rights advocate, fully affiliated with the left, and here I am, populist right. Which, by the way, let me get one last point in on this. Like you can't say right-wing populism and exclude the president whose daughter and son-in-law are Jewish and who's done nothing but combat anti-Semitism at elite universities. So anyways, I think we agree on that, but I think that's a good sort of pin to put in.
Yeah. I didn't know we were that close, actually, in some ways. I suspect if we dig a little deeper, we'll find some differences, but that's all right.
Fair.
In the meantime, let's enjoy the consensus. So I'm fascinated by the entry of anti-Semitism into sort of anti-woke politics. Now, I wrote a book about it in a way, but December 5th was this fascinating moment. December 5th was the hearings that you were involved with behind the scenes. You'll talk about that, I'm sure, that in which members of Congress and the House Education Committee brought the presidents of several universities for an inquisition. I'm not going to say interview about why their universities had failed to combat anti-Semitism. Harvard, MIT, Penn, and Columbia. Right? Did I get them all?
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. Was Columbia part of the original mix? I think that might have come second.
Harvard, Penn. I know Harvard and Penn.
Yeah, Harvard and Penn for sure, and MIT I know was also part of it. So, and that brought the conversation to the forefront, and it was interesting because people like me were saying, look, we've got to not make this about anti-Semitism, because what we're seeing out there, this ideological fervor, is producing anti-Semitism. So the larger battle for the Jewish community and for America, by the way, which I don't separate in my own mind, is to fight against this radical ideology. And I still believe that, fighting for American values, Western values, however we define them, right? And that will then mitigate against anti-Semitism, even on the far right, if that as well, if the consensus strengthens in the middle of American politics. But then come these hearings that shock the country, and all of a sudden, I hear people within sort of, whether the classical liberal camp or the anti-woke camp, start to say, finally, the Jews might be getting on board here, and they welcomed it because it seemed to actually bring into focus finally this ideological disaster in higher education,
right?
And that brought people like Bill Ackman into the picture and others who were now bringing their trustee colleagues in and putting pressure on universities, and it changed the dynamics. So let's start there. Like, what is your perception of all of that, and what was your role in it?
Yeah, no, it's a great place to start. So I have to it's funny. So when you mentioned the Inquisition, and we'd previously mentioned Christian nationalism, so I guess we're back.
I should be careful with my language, right?
Yeah.
Right. I'll be careful.
This is where the Catholics get really excited, right? So so totally, I agree with your take. So I guess real quick, my role, Jonathan Podluzny, our former director, testified, and I had just joined AFPI, and so I was doing I was supporting the testimony and building like the graphs and really looking at the data on both the anti-Semitic incidents. And so some of those are recorded by the New York Times, and then there's a separate record of encampments. And there are a lot of graphs in that testimony, which is kind of interesting because you can't talk a graph, right? But you can the testimony is available at our website, and I think it's in the Congressional record as well. But you can see how various measures of eliteness, whether that's selectivity or price of admission or what have you, are positively related to these anti-Semitic incidents. I mean, it really was a crisis at elite campuses in particular. Yes. And that speaks to the relationship between anti-Semitism and the broader crisis of kind of woke identity, woke culture, and this oppressor-oppressor dynamic, right? So I think to tie everything together, the point that one of the points you make in your book is that the defense of Jews, or the resistance to anti-Semitism, always has to be sort of embedded in a larger narrative and a larger movement for justice and for and really a connection to American values, of which the civil rights was obviously the classic version of that, right?
Yes.
And the reason why, so why is that? Well, 2% of the population, that's why, right? I mean, you got it. There has to be this bigger story. And I think you make the case that story, that connection on the left doesn't work anymore. Today is very clearly sort of center, like liberal center to the right is where that connection has to be. And the reason is that the oppressor-oppressed paradigm almost it almost can't avoid putting Jews and Asians and other groups that are generally upwardly mobile.
It can't help itself. It just can't.
Right. And it doesn't matter.
It may not be intrinsic, but it's inevitable.
Exactly. And there are some people who've been involved, we've talked about before, who've tried to say, no, we're on your team, and they don't care. It's like they don't care, and they're not going to care. And
they're not going to care. No, the die is cast, and you're out. You're not in it. No, I think that's right. But before we go there too much, when that all was happening, there were some voices within the classical liberal movement who said, wait a second here. All you're doing is replacing one form of wokeism with another. And so what you're now doing is you're taking Jewish claims of victimhood on campus. You're inflating them in a way that's illiberal. You're telling everybody that they must agree in order to try to even the score with the leftist form of indoctrination. Now you're indoctrinating everybody into this idea that anti-Semitism is the big threat. I disagree with that.
I do too,
but of course it doesn't mean it's completely false at all times. It may be that there are people who are saying, well, only Jews get to define anti-Semitism, for example, which is something you hear about. And I don't agree with that. I think you have to leave that an open conversation. So if someone says, well, I don't think there's as much anti-Semitism as you're making out, I have to at least allow that to be an acceptable form of discourse. I can't say, no, that you're an anti-Semite because of that, or you're
right.
And I have to be willing to discuss the matter. But I think what it did do is it did show people what happens when you allow this oppressor dynamic to run amok in institutions, and ultimately it becomes it persecutes.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and I think that there's always going to be this sort of libertarian critique that we should always contend with. That you're putting certain things outside the realm of the possible, the speakable, right? That's relevant, and I think there's been a variety of people, voices who've sort of hit back on this IHRA definition.
Yes.
The point that I would make, and I think that it's a really interesting issue because you can often find very, very small differences or disagreements in this very large space, and it's possible to blow those things too much out of proportion. But I think the point that I would make, whether it's about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, the IHRA definition, this topic of sort of creating a new political correctness or what have you, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that what the discussion is over is violence, harassment, and intimidation. And the question is, at what point do these forms of action constitute anti-Semitic violence, harassment, and discrimination? I am a total libertarian when it comes to speech, but having a bullhorn in front of your window is not exactly what we're talking about. There are those lines. Those lines are already there.
We can make a distinction, a clear distinction, a bright distinction between speech and action. Although that doesn't mean I'm not going to critique the speech. It just means that I'm not going to treat it as being, as violating the core rules of the institution. If I see a bunch of college students, massively associating themselves with Hamas, that's still part of the phenomenon I'm critiquing.
Exactly. So when the speech becomes action, the question is the action a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act?
Yes.
And at that point, these questions of what constitutes anti-Semitism, that is the point that matters. Not when you stand up in the classroom and you say, well, actually, I think, and then you say something anti-Semitic. It's like, hey, that's free speech. I'm sorry to hear that. You know what I mean? Here's my view why you're wrong. So I do think there's still plenty of room to sort of debate maybe some of the particulars, and I think that's fine. And I think there's always a give and take to these things. But I think we're similar on this one as well, where I just don't think that. I think that Title VI covers Jews. Like it covers, and guess what? It covers whites, covers Asians, covers blacks, covers everybody. So it's
especially
what it is.
As it's being reinterpreted after the affirmative action decision by the Supreme Court. It's interesting. Nadine Strawson, who's a legal scholar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. And I had her on a podcast last season, if you will. Okay. And we were talking about what's going on in campus. And she urges us to level up rather than level down. And what she means by that is, let's say a university like Harvard or Penn, has a very aggressive microaggression policy, which they tend to, and yet, don't want to say anything about anti-Semitism on their campus. So they're applying one standard for other protected minority groups or marginalized communities, if you will, and another for Jewish students. That's the double standard that we're seeing. And there's one school of thought that says, Nadine Strausson's, and this is, I think, where I come into, is level up. Okay. In other words, don't try to get Jews covered as one of those groups under the microaggressions. Yeah. There's another articulated by my namesake, David E. Bernstein, a scholar at George Mason Law, and he and I have a joint paper that's in the works on this, where he says, wait a second, there are two liberal values, not one. One is free speech, and the other is equal protection. Mm-hmm. Both of those are liberal values. And if Jews are not being equally protected by these universities, then if they're not going to level up on free speech, then they better level down. Now, his theory is there that if when they won't be able to level down, they won't want to include Jews as a protected class, and it will ultimately force them back into the free speech camp. I actually think that's wrong. I think it's much more likely that most of them will then just find a way of pretending that they're including Jews in the mix, but really not do so, and it'll keep these universities where they are. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting the latter approach of like pretending to include Jews. When you have enough, you have like your was it Jewish Voices for Peace, and so there are enough of people who, for like sort of social desirability and virtue signaling and the rest, are just give them anything and they'll come, So I kind of get that. I think I hate to do the kind of politician thing and like split the difference, but I think that if you're thinking about both free speech and equal protection, if you frame this in terms of the larger DEI problem, and again you think in terms of coalitions, then I think that the smart thing to do would be to say that no one is denied equal protection under the law, and that includes other groups that are targeted by the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, right? And everyone has free speech, and I think that's the right approach. You've mentioned this as well. Like, you don't want to have. It's not strategically smart, but it's also not. It's not an ethical position to say that my discrete little group has special privileges that other groups don't have. Again, Title VI is for everyone. So right. I don't know. I feel like that's kind of between the two positions, but I could also see a case that we're now talking. I'm not really sure, actually, now that I kind of work it over in my head.
Yeah, well, you think about it more. Maybe we can all write a paper on it at some point, flesh it out. We're all, sometimes I go back and forth in my own mind. Maybe my namesake is right on this. We'll see. What do we do about higher education? So obviously the game has changed a lot since Donald J. Trump was elected. And, he's now coming after these universities in a very aggressive way, in a way that would have been unthinkable with probably any other Republican president, by the way, but certainly under any Democrat. There's some people saying he's going too far, like he's, maybe in the process of going after university funding, which, I think is completely legit and probably has to happen to a degree. He's going after research funding for medical research, and the United States is going to end up, with a problem there. Or that that it's illegitimate to go after the 501c3 status of Harvard, and that feels a little bit too aggressive as a redress of the situation at Harvard. What is your take on all that?
Well, I guess so I'm kind of in the Rufo camp on this, and I think that what's happened that's been a revolution in American politics is that the civil rights state is now an actual ground for contestation. So what existed formerly as a kind of left-only ratchet that could be turned every progressive administration, and then Republican administrations would do nothing. They wouldn't reciprocate. They would sometimes talk in sort of Goldwater-esque terms about maybe this is too much. No one should have this power. But what we're seeing with President Trump is actually seizing the reins, putting them to use for the actual intended textual purpose of the underlying statute, in this case the Civil Rights Act of '64, which does not by the way, include disparate impact, and you can't find it in there. So I know that's really on the Title VII side, but this was procedural equality. That's what civil rights was supposed to be. It was equality, not equity. And so I'm for using those tools, and I'm for using the tools where appropriate to extract concessions on things like anti-Semitism that they should be doing anyways. And I would add on viewpoint diversity, universities should be a place where, unless you have an explicit religious mission, it says like, we're here to make good Catholics, we're here to make good Jews, what have you. You should be open to all viewpoints. You shouldn't stigmatize. You shouldn't have biased response teams for people's opinions. I think if these elite Ivies want to take the position that they're essentially religiously progressive, then that ought to be their position, and they ought to put that in their charter essentially, and find a way to sort of operate that way. But they shouldn't be telling people that they're open to a range of viewpoints and then essentially stigmatizing, overtly discriminating against conservative hires and faculty as diversity statements, which are blatant. That's a religious test. That's all that is, right?
Let's go back to my perhaps unfounded fear of overreach. Going into, like, you look at what happened in Florida with Ron DeSantis' agenda, which again, I support a lot of it, but in the end, they tried to ban the teaching of quote unquote divisive concepts, by which they mean really critical race theory, mostly, maybe gender ideology and the like. You could argue that's the kind of overreach that could happen. In other words, that in trying to sort of disempower the civil rights state in universities and the ideological, homogeneous bureaucracies and everything else, that you put in power a group of people who now then implement this sort of divisive concepts idea. The ideal for me, by the way, would be for my kid to go to college or even in their senior year in high school to say, okay, you've read this book about Ibram X. Kendi, now read the book by John McWhorter, which contests what Ibram X. Kendi says. Right. Look at both of those, because I want my kid to be equipped to be able to, with critical thinking skills, to be able to debate these issues, because these are going to, one way or the other, they're going to be exposed to them. So I want them to actually have to thought them through. So I don't want to ban divisive concepts. I want something that I've virtually never seen, or maybe have seen in a few cases, where those concepts are actually debated. I'm wondering if you share my concern that in that process, that we might actually lurch toward another form of illiberalism.
Well, yeah. So I share your, I think, desired outcome. I would say there are kind of two ways to think of this. One is you never get to the 50-yard line if you play for the 50-yard line, right? You have to play for the end zone. And you can't.
You might end up in the end zone, though.
Well, there's that possibility. I'm going to give the left their due, though, which is I think that they care about these things as well, since they've built a religion around it. But I think that's a quasi-religion. But I think that's a minor point. I think the more relevant, the more interesting point is that there's a distinction between K through 12 schools and higher education. I think that divisive concept bans that essentially are banning teaching kids to sort of hate and resent themselves if they're white, their other students if they're not white, or their country and so forth. I think that's absolutely appropriate at the K through 12 level. The left likes to talk about how terrible ethnic nationalism is, and it can be terrible. But ethnic nationalism can also be this broader thing of an inclusive vision of our culture and our.
It can be patriotism.
It is, right. Well, but then
Jonah Goldberg makes a bright line distinction. I think he's been challenged on that even by some of his friends, between ethnic nationalism and patriotism.
Right. Right. Well, so that's kind of where I was going, is you can't, on the one hand, be against ethnic nationalism in any form and then be against civic nationalism in any form.
Right.
It's what are you left with? There's no nation, right? And so civic nationalism comes from the stories that we tell about our history and our values, and primarily what we're teaching to kids in K through 12 schools. And so if you take the position that you can't prohibit, as a matter of official school curricula, the anti-civics, that is critical race theory, right?
Yes.
Which is
an anti-civics. That's a great phrase.
It's literally an anti-civics, right?
I'm going to steal it and
Please.
Not credit you. No, I'll credit you.
Yeah, well, I don't know who I stole it from.
Okay,
so it's
we're all plagiarizers, yeah.
Right. Well, Claudine Gay, right? I mean, it's the new. There's this joke about that. It was this great meme, and you've seen the sort of progressive catechism. In this house, we believe, and da da da.
Yeah.
And the last one was plagiarism is okay. So I thought that was awesome.
I haven't seen that one, but I might be tempted to buy it if I see it.
Yeah. So that's the millennial old /Zoomer thing where my mind goes to memes now for everything. So it's kind of like a brain rot. But okay, so where were we? So we were talking about K through 12 versus higher education. So I completely agree that higher education should be a place where you're challenged with uncomfortable ideas. There's no problem of being challenged with.
The problem is they're not being challenged with uncomfortable ideas.
100%.
Right.
100%. So I would not. My ideal place would not be one that excludes divisive, sort of radical left-wing ideas from the higher education space. I do think there's a good question. There's an issue as to whether or not certain departments and degrees add sufficient value from like a return on investment or an intellectual merit standpoint to warrant their continued
gender studies program that is so controlled by a bunch of
100%.
ideologues and doesn't actually entertain any alternative views, is illiberal to its core.
Yes.
And the right. Yeah.
So your goal is, as an institution, what it should be is advancing truth, advancing knowledge, a bunch of postmodern influenced departments, right? That are explicitly arrayed against the idea that there's an objective reality and an objective truth that you're trying to achieve, and that they're basically just politics masquerading as scholarship. Yeah. I would say there's an argument to be made that those are not areas that I would prioritize if I were, right? But I would never be of the view that a person cannot reference some thinker, some writer, and so forth in higher education.
But by the way, interestingly, this came up in a debate that Barry Weiss hosted between Chris Rufo and Yashka Monk. And Yashka Monk asked him about the divisive concepts. And I'd never heard this before, but Chris Rufo basically acknowledged in his very careful way that that wasn't part of the original plan. And that was put in by a Republican, legislator during the debate over this. So that was later put in, and then if you're Chris Rufo or Ron DeSantis, you're stuck with the package deal, which talks about one of my critiques of classical liberalism with my classical liberal friends is that classical liberalism tends to hate politics. It wants everything to be open for discussion and debate, but politics actually requires winning and losing. You have to play politics to a degree and know that you're not going to be completely intellectually pure in the process, because you'll never change anything, because politics is how things change.
And conservatives have the same problem on a slightly different reason. They hate politics because they hate the government. Right?
They hate the government,
so
right.
they just, Curtis Yarvin has this quip where he says that they just want to grill. They just want to, the flag's up in the yard. They're going to have friends over, grill hamburgers, and they don't want to be involved in politics. It's like, well, politics wants to be involved in you. So
right, you better get with the program one way or the other.
Right.
In that way, I agree with Rufo that classical liberals, you can't op-ed your way out of out of this. But on the other hand, I think that the question is, well, what are you trying to actually accomplish through politics? And that's where there might be some differences of opinion. Before Trump, if you asked me the single most hopeful sign of reform, and it would have been excruciatingly incremental, was these centers for civic thought that started to emerge in certain universities, right? That were genuinely intellectually open, whatever university ought to be in the humanities or social sciences. These universities were bubbles within the university that were actually doing what we think ought to be done everywhere. And I thought, well, maybe that's going to win out over time, and any smart student will want to be part of those programs and not part of the, gender studies or ridiculous, ideologically driven humanities. Where are we with that now, with all of that?
I love the civic centers. I'm a huge proponent of this. It's an area where I want to take our work and expand it dramatically. It's not an area we've done a lot in, but I would say that's in the top one or even two. I would say top two issues that I'm looking to do more work in, I think, on AFPI's behalf. I think that, so there is a concern with those that you don't sort of outrun your talent pipeline and collapse, because the viewpoint discrimination is so extreme in higher education. I don't know how I got into Georgetown, by the way. It was probably some kind of clerical
I don't
error.
Either. Right.
Because I'm not.
Your DEI statement must have been a just disaster.
I don't think they had. That's probably what it was. Is they didn't have a DEI statement.
Okay.
But because I actually applied to places that had DEI statements, and I just filled them out like honestly. Like I'm never going to bend the knee on this stuff. So if I'm op-edding from a box around the corner somewhere, then that's what it's going to be. You know what I mean? But
right.
Yeah, so I think there is a concern that that you just don't have the people there, and so the rollout of the civic centers has to be done in a sort of deliberate way.
It can't grow too quickly, ironically, because there's not enough of an intellectual pipeline because we're not bringing enough PhDs in those fields. Although it may be that there's more silent support for that among professors. And to give you an example, I was at the University of Michigan and I was meeting with a Jewish professor in history. I'm not going to name his name. Whose first words out of his mouth were to go off on Ron DeSantis, by the way, and everything that was going there. And then I looked at him and I said, "What about all this DEI stuff at your university?" And he looked at me and he looked outside.
He did one of these.
Yeah, did one of these exactly. He says, he says, "I hope they're all purged." Okay, so you can imagine that people like him, they are really classical liberals who have been languishing under this sort of oppressive DEI regime in the universities, angry that the PhD student that they had worked on, who happened to be white, didn't get a job at anywhere. They may be able to fill some of those slots.
My biggest frustration, and this is where you are going to be much more helpful than me, because I'm not in that club, because I'm not one of the good classical liberals whose reflexes to rant about Ron DeSantis. I think it's more comfortable to punch right, because liberalism or progressivism today is not what it was, though it's not what it was 20, 30 years ago. That's the continuity, right? And obviously, we punch left, I punch left, they punch right. That's fair. But these people who have tenured positions in these institutions, they see the kind of Gramscian infiltration. And what do? You know what I mean? They said, well, I don't want to lose my spot. And I don't know. Maybe in some cases there's nothing they could do, but I feel like there was far too much willingness to kind of roll over and allow this to occur. I can tell you, if I were dictator of the universities, I wouldn't be purging intellectuals on the basis of their viewpoints. That's just not a thing that I would do. So, am I the bad guy?
I had a philosophy professor in college who taught philosophy. He was taught rationalism and so forth. And at some point he said, "By the way, I'm a good communist." And this is in the late 1980s, so I'm like, and I realized that had nothing to do with his teaching. I took two classes from him, and both were completely academic and straightforward. And so it doesn't have to be that we have ideological litmus tests and that dictates how one teaches, if that's your philosophy of teaching.
Yeah.
We have the higher education K through 12 loop. I mean, right now, and I had my last guest, or one of my last guests, was a guy named Lyle Asher, who wrote a piece about that. It's going back several years ago, actually, well before 2020. About how ed schools are a menace to higher education. They're actually a menace to K through 12 education as well. But he really detailed how this group of radicals came into power, and then, by the way, peopled the bureaucracy of higher education. So you have these PhDs from ed schools who took charge of the bureaucracies. And now, of course, they're putting out teachers in K through 12 education that are very ideological. Core to that is this idea of decolonizing the curriculum, purging it of its Western thought and Western influences and the like. Then you have the teachers' unions, and the radicals take hold there, and they're starting to spread this pedagogy in school systems, particularly in blue areas around the United States, places that Jews live in, by by the way.
The pedagogy of the oppressed, I think, is the term.
That's Paulo Freire, right? Yeah. In his famous book, which we're reviewing right now and trying to break that down for people so that they understand how influential that was.
Right.
And so that pedagogy of the oppressed is spreading. It's in school systems. Interestingly, by the way, and I'd like your take on this. This is a blue state problem, right? The places where you're not, I mean, I know you're in a you're in a red area, if not a red state, right? Mostly.
Yeah, Virginia. I mean, it's still kind of bluish.
If you go farther enough south, you're going to all of a sudden be in a blue area.
I was in Montgomery County, which I think you were.
I
am
as well,
right now.
Right. It's very, very, very blue here, and it's very, very. The schools are very ideological, and so it's interesting. We're at a moment when you have a Republican powerhouse now pushing against this stuff, but they're Republicans, and all of these are local blue state problems. How do you see this resolving itself? Is this going to help the matter because Trump and his team have genuine power of the purse in some ways, which they have less of in K through 12 than they do higher education? Or is this going to exacerbate it because it just gives a new form of resistance permission to come out and say our resistance is sticking with DEI and doubling down on DEI?
It's a really good point, because you run into federalism and there are, so I do think that the Department of Education has civil rights authorities, but I don't know what its tools would be on curricula at the state level, and that really is pretty limited.
It can stop supporting neo-Marxist curriculum in California, which it did under Biden.
True.
So that's all ended. I have no doubt. I haven't even checked, but I have no doubt that that's all gone. But there's some power of the purse, but it's not much. I mean, local school districts get a very small percentage of their budget from federal government.
10%.
If I've heard even lower, like 4%, but maybe. And state governments get around 10 to 15%, I think, of their budgets. So I don't know what levers of power we have and to what degree this is going to create more harm than good for us. It might, my sense is the momentum will carry over and help us in blue cities as well, even though it will create some backlash. But do you have thoughts on that?
I think I do, and I think you're right. As this is maybe a very conservative thing to note, but it seems as though blue cities, blue states are losing a lot of people for a reason. And I think, and it's not just this issue, it's also crime, it's governance, and things like that. So it's possible that the deterioration you're describing worsens has political consequences that further marginalize sort of these extremist policies in terms of their national impact, because it worsens the position in national politics for Democrats, while at the same time entrenching them further. I think the fascinating thing is, if you look at actual public opinion polling on all of these issues, whether it's particularly gender stuff, I mean, these are 80-20 issues, right? And so it's a problem within progressive politics. And I don't know, like this is the tension for wedge issues. And so, speaking now as a political scientist by training, like wedge issues, they can tend to create a national advantage while at the same time solidifying the underlying problems. So, like when President Trump weighed in on the athletes not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, it went from being an 80-20 issue to being a 60-40 issue. So it's a winner politically, but now you have 40% who are against standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, which is like, so I don't know that I have a good solution to your problem. I think you may be right. I think there has to be something that happens within progressive politics, and you can see, for example, the arch progressive governor of California sort of getting his feet wet in this, and in a very transparently insincere kind of way.
Maybe his politics to the woke left was the insincere part, and this is the real Gavin Newsom. I don't know.
Sure, yeah.
We can guess on that. Either way, obviously, it's opportunistic, but it does tell you that the winds are changing. I don't think it's because that Trump initiated a DEI backlash. I think it's because they're starting to recognize that the politics of woke doesn't work well for them, and that the future, they're making a bet with the future. The future is of a rational Democrat who's willing to forego identity politics.
Yeah, and part of the fascinating thing that's happened just on the politics front is that the oppressor-oppressed coalition has tended to lose more members of the groups they coded as oppressed, right? So it turns out that it's particularly toxic to young Black and Hispanic men who have any sense of dignity and don't want to be infantilized. Imagine that, right?
Right, exactly.
Right. And so
respect power, or don't, don't like gobbledygook, or don't be like being called Latinx or whatever,
There's a bigger challenge even beyond the woke. There's a bigger challenge, I would say, in left-wing politics where this type of thinking goes, where it's like, of course you can't get voter identification. You're African American. It's like, what?
Yes, exactly.
What are you talking about?
Even when I supported that, because my organization supported, I was always like, we can't ask people for their ID to vote. Right. That sounds, okay, all right. I don't need to have this argument. I'll go ahead. I'll go along with it. But
Set
I just
that
remember,
aside, come back to it.
Yeah. But once I was free from, the politics of the Jewish left in that way, or the politics of the civil rights community, which implicated the Jewish organizations, I was like, why are we standing so firm on that? It seems ridiculous. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I think we agreed much more, and it would be sort of, I feel like I need to have maybe it's an offline session with you trying to say let's actually figure out where we disagree more, because I think that there are things that we disagree with. I do have reservations about this administration, not because I do think it has to fight and use all the tools of power to try to reform higher education, reform K through 12. But I want to do it in withhold money if you have to withhold money. Mm-hmm. Maybe not the research money that we need to fund certain things. I want to hear more from them about what their plan of action is on that, to make sure we don't destroy medical research in the process of leveraging these universities.
I would tend to agree, by the way, with that. I think that people tend to, like, do you remember the broad grant freeze that happened early on? And everyone's like, oh my God, they're cutting the money. It's like grants are annually administered. So this isn't forever, so and I would say the same thing for these medical things as well. Like, what won't kill American medical research is if one institution has to actually enforce Title VI in order to get their grant research. Like, I promise you, that's not going to end innovation in medicine.
I think it is overstated. It's a political tool to go, hit the Trump administration. You use the metaphor of the football field and whether or not they get a touchdown. I have to take that at least the possibility seriously in the process, so that I don't get caught up in that overreach, and that I maintain my own integrity in this conversation. Even as I say, I try to call balls and strikes, but I continue to do that.
Well, if it turns out that they reach the end zone and it's somewhere I wouldn't want to be, I may end up writing a book like yours at some point.
Right, exactly. I'm going to call upon you to do it, and publicly too.
Exactly.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate the conversation, and look forward to continuing it. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for
having me,
David.
Thanks so much for being really a stalwart and standing up against anti-Semitism. It means a lot.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And look, it's like civil rights are for everybody. That's kind of my view. So
beautiful. Thank you.
Awesome.
Take care.
Great talking to you.